I'm going to talk a little bit now about the differences between paint and texture, and between like materials, the texturing that you do with texture maps, as opposed to using paint, and the way they're different and how to use them. So the main differences are that paint doesn't use an actual texture map. It doesn't use an image that you load to do the color on the object. Now, basically, the way paint works is you pick a color, and then you paint on the surface of the object using the paint tools. Now, the way this is working is that it's actually changing the color values of the points of the object, since the object is made up of a bunch of vertices, little points that kind of like a big connect the dots to make the shape. If I zoom in here, you can see it a little bit better, but it's basically a bunch of polygons, little triangles connected together. Each point in the triangle can hold a color value, and basically when you're painting on the surface, it is changing the color value of each point and then creating a 3-point gradient on the triangle between the 3-point vertices that have different color values. So the way paint works is it's actually embedded in the object. The object is actually getting the color changed on the surface. Now, the advantages to this are the fact that you don't have to have an actual image map with the file to wrap onto the object, and you can paint right on the surface, which is the advantages. But the disadvantages to this, and I'm going to go ahead and make more of a hard-edged brush here to show that the disadvantages are that since the paint on the surface is based on the vertices and how many polygons you have, you can see where I'm getting some angular edges here to the paint on the hard edge paint because it's having to paint only where vertice points are. And if I come into Composer and I were to rotate this around so you can see it, if I were to change the density of the mesh and make it less dense, you can see that as there are less polygons, the less detail you're going to get in the paint. So all the detail you get in paint is based off of the density of the mesh. Because if I look at the wireframe here, since there's less wireframe now, you can see there's a lot less detail in the paint that I just did. But if I go back to where there was more detail, there's more detail in the object. Of course, you'll get more detail in the paint. Now, texture maps don't work that way. Texture maps, even if there's really low detail, it's still going to put high detail in the image because it's actually wrapping an image around those polygons. So it doesn't base it on the points, it bases it on how to wrap the full image on a polygon. So you can have one polygon that has a pristine texture on it. If you come into materials and use texture and load an image, like for example, if I were to load the lynda.com logo here, and I'll go ahead and change my mapping. So you can see that even though it looks a little low detailed here, if I were to change the detail, the object lower, in your view here it will look like there isn't that much detail, but when I actually render this, when I actually render this object out now, even in low detail, it's still going to keep the image in a high detail. You can still see how crisp and clear the detail of that image is, whereas if I were to go ahead and remove that texture to where the paint is lower detail and then render that, you'll see that the paint stays a low detail. So that's the main differences between paint and texturing, is that you get lower detail with the paint as on the surface of the object, even though it's nice to have that feature so you can paint on the surface. And in some ways it can be better to have paint on a surface of an object. But those are the differences between the two. One last thing I'm going to show in this section, I'm going to close this project. I have a little character head that I've created, this creature, and And the eyes already are textured. They've got paint on the surface there because I didn't really need to have a full texture for the eyes. But I want to show a cool little trick for creating a texture map for a face or a circular type object like this head here. And the trick is using a depth scan. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to a front view. And the way depth scans work is it actually creates a depth image based on the way it scans the object, whether it's circular, cylindrical, or planar. And it's found in the render settings. And it does it based off of your camera view. So I want to make sure I'm on the front view because I want to have a depth scan based off the front view of my object. And in the render settings, you have 3 options for depth scan. Planar will just do a straight depth from your view. Cylindrical will do like a cylindrical unwrap of the depth, and a spherical will do a spherical unwrap. So I'm going to go ahead and use a spherical depth scan. And to show you what this does, I'll keep it at 550 by 400. And I'll do render. Now, what you'll see, unwrap the model of this head based on the spherical depth of the object. And what you can see here is that it's actually got white areas where the higher elevations of the object and gray and black areas where the lower elevation of the object are based on a spherical version of the object. And I'm going to go ahead and save this image. And we'll go ahead and use a JPEG. And we'll call this depth scan. And hit save. And what I'm going to do is show you that since that unwrapped from this object, if I were to texture map that back on this object, it's going to line up perfectly. First what I'm going to do is go into, I have Photoshop open here, and you could use any image editor with it, but I like using Photoshop, so I'll show you what I do with it. So I'll go find my depth scan image here. Here it is, depth scan JPEG. And here's my depth scan image. So what I want to do is make an image that I'm going to use to differentiate areas on the surface where I'm going to put texture. So what I like to use is the image adjust curves in Photoshop. And what this can allow me to do is to actually use the different white and gray values of the white, gray, and black values of the image and adjust where certain areas of the image are lighter and darker based on the gradient of the grayscale. So that looks pretty good. I think I'm going to use that. So now I've created this new pattern based on that object's depth scan. I'll go ahead and say save as. We'll call this depth scan 2. And we'll go ahead and make it maximum. And I can go ahead and quit out of Photoshop here and go back into Amorphium. And now what I'm going to do is in material, actually first thing I'm going to want to do is in mapper is go ahead and take the head and make sure that it is spherical mapped, and then go into materials here and then choose mixer. And then I'm going to go into, by clicking on the little square there, go into the options for mixer. And under mixer, this is where you can choose a black and white image to modify 2 different sections of a texture. I'm going to go ahead and choose texture here. And it's going to ask me for a texture, so I'm going to go find that depth scan 2 image that I made. And now what it's doing is it's actually taking that image that I had made and basically taking white and red and blending the 2 together. So I can change this. Let's make one green here, and we'll edit this and kind of make it a darker green. And this one will make clouds. So there is some modeling going on, like some not so even color. And then we'll edit the clouds. And then make this kind of a purple. So we'll start with a red, edit, and add a little bit of blue. and take some of the saturation out so it's not so purple. And we'll turn this to white and bring it down a little bit so it's kind of a gray. And we'll take the green down a little bit too. Actually, let's make this less saturated. There we go. So now I've got the texture laying on the object based on the shape of the object. And I could do the same with bump map by coming in here and choosing mixer and then choosing texture again and adding the depth scan. And then actually we'll let this one be the area where the bumps are and turn this one off. And then in this area we'll change this to noise. We'll edit the noise and make this white and then turn it down a little. So there's a little bit of it'll be faint bumps in there. So we'll go ahead and turn it down about like that. So now there will be bumps in some areas and bumps and not in the other areas based on that same map. So now if I come back into Composer, I go back to my camera view, and now I've got the texture on the surface the way I want it. So let me go ahead and take the camera a little bit, render a test frame so you can see how he looks. Choose still image, and we'll go to 400 by 300, turn on shadows, make sure my anti-aliasing is the way I want it, choose oversample for a softer look, and we'll go ahead and render. So now I'm getting kind of the look that I wanted on my object, and you can see that I was able to get the texture map to line up better on the surface of the object based on a depth scan. And if I wanted to, I could use that depth scan in Photoshop as a reference where the eyes and eyebrows are, and actually go in and hand paint texture in Photoshop and make my own texture map in Photoshop or in another program to actually line up better on the object. But this gives you a good example of how you can use depth scan to be able to do those types of effects. And if it was a more cylindrical object, then you would use a cylindrical depth scan. Or if you've got a full body character, you might want to do a front-on depth scan of your object and use that as a reference. But that's how you can use depth scan for those types of things. And that's basically how you can use paint and texture in your scene on your objects to give a better look to your 3D models.